Oh, you should definitely ask me
We're
about
live.
the dumbest photograph I've ever taken.
Oh,
So,
good. I will. We will do that. And we're live. It is Friday, April 16th, 2021, 5 o'clock p.m. Longtime viewers of the show will remember that on my outdoor patio in what Kate calls the bamboo studio,
You call it that. I just adopted you.
a full year ago, I ordered new patio furniture. And I have talked about this on the show that the new patio furniture just did not arrive and did not arrive and did not arrive. And finally, I gave up and I canceled the order and I ordered different patio furniture, or rather, Tamara Kaufman Wittes ordered different patio furniture.
Was it on the Evergreen?
It was not. It was somewhere. It didn't get released as quickly as the Evergreen. So today, the new patio furniture actually arrived, along with that gorgeous piece of maple wood that I moved over here down the street yesterday. And so I have a new project, which is putting together the patio furniture and redoing the surface in this maple for the bamboo studio. So that is what's going to happen. It's all a sign that spring is here and that the time left before we are allowed to have fun again may be shrinking. But as for now, anyway, we are still not allowed to have fun anymore. We are allowed to have Walter Shaub, however, join
which
us.
is the opposite of fun.
You are not the first person to have responded that way when I've introduced the show by saying, as we do every day, we're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have so-and-so. Walter Shaub is not the opposite of fun unless you are Donald Trump trying to set up a fake blind trust. And in which case he is known as the nasty guy at OGE who is the opposite of fun. Walter Shaub, welcome to In Lieu of Fun.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Hello. I've got my fancy LaCroix water here. So really exactly the wildness you'd expect from a former ethics guy. So
I want to say, like, how famous did Donald Trump make so many, like, kind of like nerdy offices in government? I feel like he just made heroes of like a bunch of average citizens just doing their job like civil servants.
Yeah. You know what? And it's infuriating because we practically stood on street corners with signs held up saying we exist and nobody paid attention to us before. And I'm way more proud of what I did to get the Office of Government Ethics streamlined and standardized and professionalized for 4 years before Trump. But, that's not what'll go down in history. So.
All right. So let's actually talk about that. So What is the Office of Government Ethics? What is it supposed to do? It's obviously not there to have bighorn ram confrontations with the president, which of course it cannot win. What's its actual job?
So, it's part of the Watergate reforms from 1978. And I think they picked the lofty name specifically as part of their effort to reinstill public confidence after the Nixon catastrophes. And it, of course, never worked. Public opinion of government has continued to decline. But the name certainly is broader than what the mission of the agency is. We're not there to say this policy is unethical or that policy. This office is focused on preventing mostly financial conflicts of interest in the executive branch and to some extent business relationship related conflicts of interest. So it gets really dry, really fast. And the key word of what I just said was prevention. I mean, it's supposed to be a prevention mechanism. There are other offices that do the enforcement. And our goal, our main mission was to supervise the different ethics offices. And when I say supervise, That's the word in the statute they use, but we actually didn't even directly supervise them. There's only about 75 people at OGE. There's 4,500 agency ethics officials. So now that I've told you what they don't do, I'll tell you what they do. They issue regulations setting standards of conduct for employees. They interpret the conflict of interest laws. They conduct audits of agency ethics programs to make sure they're doing their jobs and following the rules, but they don't get involved in reviewing individual cases. It's more about checking on their processes and procedures. And then their most visible function is they work with presidential nominees for Senate-confirmed positions to review their financial disclosure reports and negotiate ethics agreements. And then, of course, they provide a lot of individual advice both to the White House and to agency ethics officials. So none of what you've heard about has anything to do with enforcement or investigations or anything like that. It's again, it assumes a system in place that is going to keep the government mostly ethical. And this office exists to put them 2 steps further back behind the line, rather than be on the front line doing battle directly with corruption.
So in other words, the way I sometimes describe it, when people who say, it didn't do anything to prevent Trump, I kind of say it's a little bit like asking a GPS navigation system to prevent a ramming of a truck into a crowd.
Yeah.
It's not what it's for.
Yeah.
It assumes the truck driver wants to avoid accidents. It's an aid to helping that, but it's not really designed to prevent you from willfully doing something deranged.
Yeah, I mean, it's primarily there for the 99.99% of federal officials who want to do the right thing. And for the ones who want to do the wrong thing, we have the FBI. I will say it did, and we saw how that worked.
That worked real well.
How did that work out?
Oh, my light just died on me. But the one area where I think it really did have a lot of success let me just fix my light here for a second so I'm not sitting in the dark on you. There's one area where I feel like it really did succeed and do a really good job even after I left. I'm really sorry, the light died here.
It's really fine. Take your time.
Okay. Preventing conflicts of interest on the part of Trump's Senate-confirmed appointees. As a result of reviewing their financial disclosure reports, and as dry as that sounds, it's really intense, involved work, especially with these wealthy nominees, and forcing them to divest things. I've avoided and will continue to avoid talking about non-public things, but I just stumbled on the IG report about Wilbur Ross, and there's a paragraph in there about how I yelled at commerce officials that I wanted Wilbur Ross to divest everything. And that office, even after I left, continued making people divest a lot of things. And there's a whole story behind why Wilbur Ross got to keep 2 categories of things, but he got rid of everything else, and he came in, as the report says, not wanting to divest anything. And even after I left, OGE continued getting those folks to divest. Now, there's the case where Elaine Chao didn't follow through, and as transportation secretary didn't keep her promise to get out of Vulcan, a asphalt company. But for the most part, your cabinet officials did plenty of bad things, but very few of them had to do with actual financial conflicts of interest, because OGE succeeded in eliminating that. And it could have been so much worse if you didn't have OGE in there. So, people always talk about how the agency completely failed. And I do feel that the weakness of the agency was exposed, and I left because I could no longer perform even the limited mission that it had. But in the area of keeping presidential appointees at the Senate-confirmed level free of conflicts of interest, it continued to do a really good job even after I left.
So one of the things, there have been a lot of proposals to improve ethics enforcement. What are the things that if Congress came to you and said, what are the 3 things we need to do to prevent a situation like this from happening again, what are the things that you would put at the top of your priorities list?
So I think the key to understanding the very first one, and really the reason that I stepped out of the shadows and risked my career by giving a press conference shortly before the inauguration criticizing Trump for not divesting his assets, is that OGE is on its own powerless. But the power and the leverage it always had was the support of the White House. And that was consistent across Republican and Democratic administrations, not even necessarily because these were necessarily good people, but because they understood there would be political costs if they had scandals. And it was easier for the White House and the president to make their senior officials in the agencies do the right thing to avoid an unnecessary headache. So as tiny as OGE was, it always had disproportionate access to the White House and could call up the White House and say, this agency or this official isn't doing what we're asking. And very quickly, if we persuaded the White House that it was an issue, they got involved and got the person in line. And that just completely ended with the Trump administration. And I knew it would end as soon as I knew he wasn't going to divest his financial interest. And I felt that that was an existential threat to the ethics program. And anything less than an existential threat, I wouldn't have risked my career. I didn't have savings. I still had student loans. I loved working for the government and didn't want to be out on the street. But I didn't see how I could be leading a program facing an existential threat and not say something. And so I think that the lesson is that, as so many people have talked about, so many of what's held the government in check and fought corruption is a matter of norms. And even when we have laws, it's a matter of enforcement. I mean, we see this ridiculous OLC policy that a president can never be prosecuted. And we saw Mueller pulling some of his punches and saying, well, I can't say he's guilty, but if he was innocent, we would have said he was innocent. And I think that goes to, or Kellyanne Conway violating the Hatch Act. Here's a clear law, but the president refused to do anything despite obvious violations. And so everything starts at the top. And what you begin to realize is that even the rule of law begins to break down, much less norms, when the president isn't in line. So I think the very first thing they have to do is resolve presidential conflicts of interest.
So here's the thing that I always am kind of struck by, which is that you called for him to divest his interests, which seems reasonable. But more than that, we didn't even have a full idea of what he would be divesting himself from. There wasn't even mandatory disclosure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's also like something that strikes me as really deeply problem. Before you even know what he's quitting, don't we want to know what he's a member of? Like, this is like.
Yeah. So, that's a really good point. I mean, obviously he disclosed this Russian nesting doll, layered onion, or whatever analogy you want to use, of companies within companies within companies. The bigger concern isn't so much what he owns as what those things he owns owe, and who they owe, and who they're doing business with, and what deals they're involved in. And none of that gets disclosed.
And I don't think power.
Yeah, and very little of that would have been in his tax returns even. So while I think tax returns would be one more piece of the puzzle that should be exposed, that wouldn't have solved the problem. You're absolutely right. I think the reason it hasn't come up before now is because in the case of cabinet officials and other presidential nominees, or OGE gets involved, they have to divest these things. And so in some ways, when they sell them off, they're no longer a problem. And so it's kind of like, it would have been nice to know, but if the person's going to get rid of it, it's just purient interest to know, and not an ongoing threat. So I do think there should be more divestiture, but if the president was going to divest almost everything, we wouldn't even really have to worry about the enhanced disclosure.
So what should the rule be? If you were, I mean,
yeah.
Presidents, we've had some pretty rich, financially diversified presidents. And
Yeah.
I got to say...
Peanut Farm. Sorry.
We got Peanut Farm. A lot of them have properties of
Whitewater
from Reagan's ranch to family compounds and whatnot.
Yeah.
Lyndon Johnson owned some radio stations, if memory serves. Should the rule be no controlling managerial role in anything and blind to any management? Should the rule be Vanguard mutual funds only, right? You can own as much as you want, but it's got to be in something, diversified in which you're not managing it? Or should it basically be, you want to be president, don't have private interests that you're allowed to know anything about? What's the rule?
So currently there is no rule.
No. But I mean, if you were writing the rule, what should the rule be?
So there are three approaches, and only one of them I like. One is more disclosure so that you keep them, but we know what they are. And certainly that would have helped, especially if there was criminal activity going on, but it doesn't resolve the conflict of interest. Another might be recusal, which is what average federal employees have to do, but the president can't realistically recuse. So I don't see that as an option. I guess there's really four, because a third one would be put things in a blind trust. And one thing I never did was call for Trump to put his stuff in a blind trust.
You did criticize his trust as not blind.
I thought it was a fake blind trust. And my theory is he created that to confuse people. But his attorney was right when she stood up there and say he couldn't have a blind trust because he would know what he put in it. And that's absolutely true. So I'm not a fan of blind trust. I truly think that they should have to divest. And I have two reasons for that. One, that's what cabinet officials have to do. And they have less power than the president. So why should somebody with less power than the president, who's unlikely to be in the job for 4 years, much less 8 years, have to sell off all of these things, but the person with even more power to do harm doesn't have to sell these things off? And in fact, unlike the Secretary of Commerce, the president is going to send men and women in uniform to dangerous places where they could die. He's asking them to make potentially the ultimate sacrifice. So I don't think it's too much to ask the president to divest conflicting financial interests. This is the most powerful, or one of the most powerful positions in the entire world. The fate of a nation rests in your hands. Why should you whine and complain about being inconvenienced by having to divest?
Okay, so let's talk about the practicalities of this, because I basically...
I was just going to ask, can we define divest, like what it means? I know what this means in from my, but from your perspective, I wonder if it means something slightly different.
Yeah. So we always use the word divest when I was at OGE because we didn't care how you got rid of it. You could sell it, you could forfeit it, you could give it away. So we chose the sort of neutral as to mechanics word divest. And we really didn't care how you got rid of it. Now, the truth is, I think there needs to be more disclosure of how people are divesting, because I'm concerned that there have been some sham transactions where people have given things to, ostensibly sold something to a relative in exchange for a note, which is just an IOU. And then they could leave government, rip up the note, take the asset back. Nobody's incurred any capital gains. And the whole transaction was a sham, and they could do things to increase its value while they're in government. So I think there needs to be more disclosure of how they get rid of it. But ultimately, I just think the president needs to get rid of stuff. And if that's too hard to do, then you have no business running to be president.
Okay, so I want to come to that latter point, but let's clarify Kate's question too. So you own the Trump organization, you get elected president, you're like, holy shit, I got to divest, because Walter says divest, and I'm going to follow his advice. And so you sell the Trump organization. Presumably there's a purchase price associated with it. And presumably you're allowed to do more than put it in a checking account. What, are you allowed to put it in a sort of diversified portfolio that you're blind to? What are you, and let's say you sold it and it was worth $500 million or whatever.
Yeah.
What are you allowed to do with it?
So I actually would have no problem with a blind trust if what you're putting in the blind trust is cash, because then if you're some rich guy who wants to make a whole lot more money, the blind trustee can choose anything and you don't actually know what was bought. It's truly blind, as opposed to this fiction where you put what you know in a trust and it never gets sold. If you were to request a certificate of divestiture, which is kind of boring and complicated sounding, but if you ask the Office of Government Ethics for a thing called a certificate of divestiture, and OGE issues it, you're allowed to not pay capital gains taxes that year. You ultimately pay them later in life when you sell the rollover property. But what it is you take the proceeds of the sale and you can dump it in only one of two things, either diversified mutual funds or government bonds, both of which are deemed non-conflicting. And so if the president wanted a certificate of divestiture, which I'm sure they would want to defer the capital gains and make money on the money they held off on paying taxes on, the law would require them anyways to do that. And we saw that with Henry Paulson when he sold about $750 million worth of shares of Goldman Sachs and bought mutual funds. And the reason he bought mutual funds is because he got a certificate of divestiture. And The Economist wrote a really cynical article about how they felt he only went into government to get the CD. I actually have a little more faith that he went in for legitimate reasons, but maybe I'm naive.
So, okay. So last question on this line. If you're
Hank Paulson, I have another question.
Oh, no, I mean my last question on this
okay.
line. If you're Hank Paulson, you can sell off as many shares of Goldman Sachs as you need to, and you can buy as many shares of, Vanguard as you need to, and you can do that instantly. If you're Donald Trump and you basically have your assets are a bunch of real estate and the Trump organization, and all the holdings are in this as you describe, a sort of nesting doll network of LLCs, and let's leave out the fact that a whole lot of their work is probably fraudulent anyway. But that would be an argument against, say, running for president. But
right.
And then you unexpectedly get elected. Divesting yourself of the Trump organization, that is a complicated proposition and something that is not obviously doable in 3 months. So is your position, if that's your situation, then don't run for president, or then do the divestiture before you run? Like, how would you suggest, if, leaving aside the criminality, which I'm sure is there, but presumably there's some businessman with comparable holdings in complexity that doesn't have that, comes to you and says, hey, I really want to run for president, but I actually don't know if I can logistically pull this off, the divestiture, in the period of time between election and transition. What's the right answer for that person?
So keep in mind that becoming president isn't a thing that happens to you. It's not like one day they kick down your door and drag you out and like tie you up and throw you into the Oval Office and release you and say, okay, go. You chose this. And so the burden's on you. You're asking the American people to give you the most power that they give anyone in the entire world, and promising you're going to use it solely for their benefit. You need to have a plan before you even do that. I will say that although he may, depending on how truthful his claims about his wealth were, have been the richest person in government since George Washington, but he's not the only billionaire, and he's by far not the only multi-hundred millionaire. And the nominee program was my primary function for over a decade. And I worked with plenty of people who had really complex financial holdings who managed to resolve them. And most of them had kind of a plan before they showed up. Now, I get that Trump probably was the real life example of the movie The Producers and really had planned to lose and accidentally won. But, he played that game and got surprised and won. And so one thing you could do, if you're not a complete idiot, is enter into some contingent sales where if I win, we'll go forward with the sale. And if I don't, it falls apart. Or I'm rich enough, I'm going to give it to my kids and I'm done. But he made a choice, and the burden's on him to solve that problem, not on us, because he asked us for this power and we gave it to him. So really this falls in the area, and I'm not even being snide. It's not our problem. It's his problem. And if you're going to run for that job, you need to have a plan. Now, I do have one suggestion to prevent this happening again. Even if he had and I feel like the media really dropped the ball digging into conflicts of interest in the lead up to the election. But even if they had, nobody was going to change parties in this partisan world between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton over conflicts of interest. They might, however, have changed candidates if at the earliest stages of the primaries, each of the primary candidates, when there was more than a dozen Republican candidates on stage attacking each other, were forced with their initial financial disclosure filing to lay out in writing a plan for how they're going to resolve their conflicts of interest, which could be amended at any time and should be amendable at any time, because the idea is it would be a bidding war. He goes into a debate and Marco Rubio shreds him, and Chris Christie has a better plan for resolving his conflicts of interest. If he wasn't Donald Trump, but was somebody honest, he might come back in the next debate and say, well, I don't know if you've seen, but I updated my plan this morning, and it says I'm going to take these 10 other steps. So much for that criticism. And then maybe that forces a ratcheting up of what you're committing to do. Still not legally enforceable, but it could cost you maybe the next election if you didn't keep that promise. And we don't currently have that. Nobody's forcing them. And the reporters still in the 2020 election didn't talk about conflicts of interest. And I really feel like this is just a simple solution that, and I'm sure the first few times around, you'd have people who would just say, I will have no conflicts of interest, as Donald Trump did. But that statement alone would be fodder for debate moderators to ask the questions and for competing candidates of the same party. And I think there is at least some small chance that people might switch who they view as the viable candidate for their party if conflicts of interest got put front and center in the earliest debates.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm very curious. About, I have two questions, but the first one is basically, what do you think about, there was the New York Times report that basically said that the Trump Industries was like bankrupt, basically. Trump Inc. was have all of these losses and everything. Do you think that was a motivation for not divesting? That there wasn't that it just wasn't worth as much and he didn't want to show his hand in that?
It's entirely possible, and I don't know how we'll ever know. Maybe, down the line, if he gets sued or prosecuted or, goes belly up, we'll learn. But it's entirely possible he couldn't sell because it was leveraged far worse than he said and worth far less. And the brand was him. So if he bailed, it would go under. But again, that's his problem because he chose to run. And, I guess you asked for 3 suggestions. I think the other really isn't just government ethics, but there's a real problem with the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches, and Congress has to have a better mechanism for enforcing subpoenas. The McGahn subpoena is the perfect example of how this fell apart. I don't even know if they're still pursuing it, but it sure didn't get decided in court in a way that resolved it with finality. And then I think the other thing, and I could go on for 6 days straight talking about different legislative proposals, but I want to throw out one that I think will be controversial and is one that's increasingly near and dear to my heart. I actually think the single most important government ethics rule in the executive branch isn't within OGE, the Office of Government Ethics jurisdiction. I think it's the civil service protections, the things that give due process rights to federal employees when they go to fire them. And you hear all kinds of people fussing and complaining that it's so hard to fire a federal employee. Those rules don't exist for those federal employees' benefit. They exist for our benefit because these federal employees are able to refuse illegal orders and refuse to and insist on upholding the rule of law. And I think when we saw Congress fail, and then we saw the inspectors general fail, and we saw the FBI fail, the civil servants were the very last line of defense. And they held better than any other institutional mechanism we had solely because they had these due process rights. And that started falling apart in the fall of 2020, and Trump actually cracked the code with his Schedule F thing, which is a whole other story, but he found a way that he could have really destroyed broken the back of the civil service, and the current administration is going to have to work with Congress to come up with solutions to prevent that from happening in the next administration. But they held for nearly 4 years, and nothing else can say that it did that. And so I think, as unpopular as it is, we need more protection for federal employees instead of less. And if anything, you need to make it easier to hire them, not easier to fire them. And I say this as somebody who spent at least half his career in the federal government as a manager. And I have fired people. I didn't like it. And I think if you did like it, you're a horrible human being. But it's doable and it can be done. And I could give a whole lecture for federal managers on how to do it. But I think that there's a reason the Trump administration wanted to take us back to the 19th century spoils system where everybody was a political appointee. And that's that a career civil service with due process rights is a threat to a corrupt president. So I actually think that is an area where before Trump, even some people on both sides of the aisle were starting to talk about streamlining the firing of federal employees and stripping rights. And I think that they need to double down and spend the next 4 years tightening up those rights to prevent future attacks on the civil service by another corrupt president.
Yeah, I love that. My other question is like, it might be outside your purview, but I always wondered how the blend of Donald Trump, the person, versus Donald Trump, the president, and the financial aspects of his very extreme luxurious lifestyle were going to end up ethically matching, and how they were going to count basically the tickets at the end of the day of like, would he take, just like I mean, I think that we did some of this, but I was just kind of curious, like, I don't know, he had all of those trips to Mar-a-Lago and everything else. Like when he was at Mar-a-Lago, like I'm assuming everything was paid. I just don't actually know how all of the accounting works for that type of thing. Mm-hmm. And if that's even particularly new, maybe this is obviously every president kind of goes through this, but if you divest of like some of your investments, you kind of, everything you do becomes public. And I'm just kind of curious how that works.
Yeah. Interestingly, one thing he could have done if he refused to divest is meet the public part way by saying, I hereby declare that I will never visit my properties during my presidency. And I'm directing my staff that no presidential appointee or other political appointee will go to any event at any of my hotels. And of course, he did the opposite. They talked about Lobbyist Tuesdays at the Trump International Hotel.
And they tried to hold the G20 at Doral.
G7, yeah.
G7, I'm sorry.
Yeah. And in fact, they claimed they issued the award. They may have lied about it. When I was with Crew, we filed a complaint with the State Department IG because the State Department was the one that had let the contracts in the past. It could be they just lied. We never found out what contracts were let. Interestingly, that's a wonderful example of a time when public pressure actually made a difference, because Trump only backed off when Republican senators called him, and Republican senators only called him because the public was so outraged by this obvious corruption.
And that was you mentioned areas where the press fell down during the 2016. That was an area where the press was merciless and effective.
Yeah, they were very good at that.
And there were those press conferences where Mulvaney, who was then chief of staff, just got barraged with perfectly reasonable questions, but one after another, and kept trying to change the subject and was unable to do it. And I think that made a real difference.
Yeah, and I have to say, like, for all I criticized how the press handled 2016, I feel like the press improved over the 4 years of the Trump administration, and in some ways proved more adaptable than other institutions. I mean, they weren't perfect, and like any large institutional element of society, there are plenty of things to criticize, but I feel like they really got their game up between 2016 and 2020 in a lot of ways. And David Farenthold did some great work tracking the expenses that you mentioned about going to Mar-a-Lago. I don't think he traveled to Mar-a-Lago because he's decadent. I think he traveled to Mar-a-Lago because he was desperate to drum up business for his properties. And he was decadent, but I think it was the business motivation that took him down there. And that is just one of the most offensive things, how he brought foreign leaders to his own personal resort. And when he lobbed missiles at a Syrian airfield, talked on camera about how they were eating the most beautiful piece of chocolate cake you've ever seen.
It was, that's unfair, Walter. That was an awesome piece of chocolate cake. And, it's just liberal bias in the government and in the media that, I mean, look, you can say what you want about him, but that was an awesome piece of chocolate
I do have to give you, I've never tasted a Mar-a-Lago chocolate cake, so you're right, I'm not qualified to say that it wasn't.
You're just making up stuff. I mean, if this were Obama and it were, Kenyan chocolate cake, you'd be all over it.
In a tan suit.
Yeah, exactly.
I have to say there is like this element of like looking back and like remember there were so many crazy like things like that I'm just kind of like, did that really happen? And then I just like looked it up, and yes, it truly did happen. I have like Trump brags about eating the most beautiful chocolate cake during the Syrian missile strike. I just like, yep, there's the headline in Mother Jones. It's like, what happened?
One of the things David Farenthold wrote about was how the Secret Service didn't seem to be reporting expenditures in USA spending. And I don't know if he ever figured out, I wasn't able to figure out if they missed a reporting requirement or what, but it was kind of a mystery why none of those things were there. So
all right, Daniel reminds us that suggesting that we nuke a hurricane also happened.
Oh my god.
And actually,
oh my god, there's just so many things.
We should have like an hour of in lieu of fun
screaming at the child mowing the lawn.
This shit real. Did you remember when this happened?
Like really does make George W. Bush look like the most articulate, most sane.
Oh, but George W. Bush was a perfectly normal politician.
No, I remember. No, I mean, you say that, but okay, so maybe that's true. But when I was I was in college when George W. Bush was president, and there was just this seething resentment of what he had and what an idiot he was. That was the thing, was what an idiot he was, how stupid. And it's fool me once, fool me twice, won't be fooled again, or whatever it was. And then he had he got a shoe thrown at him. And then there was also, there was just he did tons of weird stuff. I mean, it wasn't misspelling potato, but it was pretty dumb. And there was and now all of that is literally, it's on the scale. It's the Overton window has just completely shifted.
Yeah, I mean,
I was always mystified by reporters who described Trump as underestimated and smart. I mean, truly, I think if you met him, he would probably be the stupidest person you ever met. And but I actually think that fits into the authoritarian mode here, because it isn't about being capable or being smart. It's about lacking morals and being ruthless. And so it's almost like something where being a dummy was part of the brand.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also the ability to say, this is about me and I can do this even though I don't know anything.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something, I'm not one of those eggheads. Tom McGuckin, the floor is yours.
Mr. Shaub, well, first of all, Ben, I wanted to show you another toy real quick.
Did you guys coordinate your outfit?
That is awesome.
Well, it's a LP cleaner. You know, I'm an analog guy, okay, not digital. Okay, I can't hear or see for shit, but I still appreciate good music on the old record player, and of course,
I have an LP player.
Excellent.
And a huge LP record collection.
Mr. Shaub, do you like your old LPs, or have you thrown them away a long time ago?
So I don't have LPs or even a record player, but I do like them. But I live in a small condo and wouldn't have space for a record collection either.
Yes. Listen, I'll get to my question. Okay, Ben, we've now established a clear link between Carla and the mole. All right, or supposedly Treasury did this a little bit. There's nothing that I didn't know already. But the whole point, the question for you, Mr. Shaub, is the 16 Trump campaign was, the Treasury says anyway, was coordinating with Russian intelligence, okay? Is that illegal or just unethical?
Well, I mean, if the coordination resulted in them getting a benefit, you probably have an argument of an in-kind contribution. But I mean, it's so obviously unethical. It doesn't have to be either or. So.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify what the Treasury Department said.
Yeah, because I'm not aware of this story.
What they said yesterday was that Konstantin Kilimnik, who was Manafort's former colleague or current colleague, who was also an agent of Russian intelligence, did in fact pass on the campaign data that Manafort had given him during the campaign to Russian intelligence.
So to Russia, not from Russia. Yeah.
Correct. So this closes one of the big mysteries of the Mueller investigation, which was Mueller reported that Manafort gave this material to Kilimnik, but said they didn't really know what Kilimnik did with it. This kind of answers that question. He did what we all would think the Russian agent would do, which is pass it on to Moscow.
Yeah.
But it's not clear to me that makes the conduct any more illegal than if you didn't know what Kilimnik did. It just makes it a bigger counterintelligence problem.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I don't profess to be a criminal law expert, so I don't want to go too far down that road. But, perhaps there's an argument that as another piece in the puzzle, it would be a step towards proving a more elaborate agreement. But standing alone, I don't know how that changes the equation.
It's also not clear, to be fair to Trump on this, it's not clear that anyone in the Trump campaign knew about this other than Paul Manafort. And so I think it does raise in a very serious way. Actually, that's not true. Rick Gates knew as well, or may well have known as well. He was certainly aware of the Kilimnik relationship. But it's not clear that whether this constitutes some sort of collusive relationship between Trump and anybody in Russia or just Paul Manafort. And so, look, I think it's a very big deal, but I would be careful about deciding what it means